Hi there, welcome to the latest edition of The Front Page. My name is Lee Mottershead. I'm joined by my Racing Post colleagues Chris Cook and Jonathan Harding, and we're going to gallop through some of the biggest racing news stories of the day. And the biggest race of the day, the biggest race of the month, of the year in the sport takes place a week on Saturday. That is the Randox Grand National, and we're going to kick off by talking about that because, gentlemen, in the Racing Post the last few days, we had a few front pages about the great race, obviously, as you'd expect. But two of them weren't just about looking forward to some of the stars on show a week on Saturday, but with people like Sarah Bradstock, who trains Mr. Vango, and past Grand National winning trainer Richard Newland, Sue Smith, Kim Bailey. All on a sort of theme that the Grand National isn't what it used to be because it's now increasingly dominated by superpowers, because it's a bit too predictable, because the best horses are winning, not at big prices, and they're expressing various ideas what they should do, what we should do with the race. One being introduce win and you're ins, one being to limit the number of number of runners any one trainer can have in the race, and the general theme is the Grand National has lost its essence. Chris Cook, has the Grand National lost its essence?
Yes.
Okay.
End of show. I mean, for me, the big change was cutting the number of runners. The other changes that have been made over the years, including the really significant one, taking the stuffing out the middle of the fences.
The course change.
I think a lot of us wondered at the time if that might prove to be like a really dramatic change. And then, as the years went by, it still looked kind of like the Grand National. It always felt to me that having 40 runners was key. It's obviously a huge number, wouldn't work at other race courses. But at Aintree, there's that much space, at least on that first run down to Beechers, to have that many runners with a degree of comfort, provided they all spread themselves out. So I was dead against cutting the number of runners to 34, and then they've done it. And we've only had one of those races so far.
Yes,
so
and you
shouldn't get carried away, right?
We could find that week on Saturday there are 10 down by Beechers and 6 each to one shot goes and wins the race.
Let's hope not.
I know, but we don't know what the race can look like forevermore.
Yeah, I guess it's right that we give the race a few chances to show us what it is these days.
Yeah.
It's the problem with that is you only get one a year, so you kind of have to judge on what we've seen. It seems to me logical that what happened last year is going to keep on happening to one degree or another. We ended up with the first four who had all won Grade 1 chases in the past. Was it Iron Maximus, Delta Work, Galvin, Minelendo? Is that right?
Yeah.
If not, I look forward to your comments.
Yeah, no.
So there's so much prize money. This is another change that I would make. You need to have less prize money. You're attracting horses that the race was never really designed for.
Before we go on to solutions, what we might do, Jonathan, what is your opening position, your opening statement on the health of the Randox Grand National? I'll ask you the same question I asked Chris.
For the court.
Has it lost its essence?
Yeah, in the sense that, it's no longer the race that it was. And then you need to determine whether people generally will fall into two camps, whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, or indeed whether that is a necessary thing or it was unnecessary. I think it's actually a case of, does it now need to be, given the spotlight that's on it, given the risk v reward of if it goes wrong versus if it goes right, does it need to be a race now for classier horses and with slightly different conditions to the old Grand Nationals? I think with the purist hat on, I would say I miss the old style, but the logical side of it, I can understand why this race of all races needs to be as squeaky clean as possible.
Okay, so my opening statement. You both had your say, what you're interested in. So I would just say, I remember watching last year's race, and my initial feeling, and I'm one that sometimes gets a bit carried away with the moment, but I felt quite euphoric in the sense that, for a start...
I remember you put that in the paper.
Yeah, I loved the fact that watching the turn for home, there were still 20-odd horses in with a chance of winning the Grand National, which meant there were 20 sets of punters in with a chance of winning the Grand National. I thought, yes, it was a very different Grand National, but if you go, I think I did it last year, but normally on Grand National morning, I'm very lucky, I walk around the track, and there's no doubt you get to Beechers Brook, and your mind does go back to what it used to be and your childhood, which for me was the Grand National Day was the best day of the year, Grand National Grandstand, Des Lynam with a host of stars at Aintree, that amazing iconic head-on shot at Beechers where they approached the fence, and you never quite knew whether your horse would get over that fence or not, and there was that sense of jeopardy, which the Grand National doesn't have in the same way. But times
I don't think it really has it at all, based on what we saw last year.
But times have changed, and there's that argument that you have to go with what society will accept. But I did still think that the Grand National looked like the Grand National in the sense that we still had what to most people are big green fences. You had lots of horses. I'm not sure the general public who tune into race once a year care or interested whether it's 40 or 34 or 32 or 36. A lot of horses. I'm not sure.
I think you noticed the difference.
Okay. Rough question. There were only 20 odd runners.
Yeah, but I mean, that I noticed then. It looked really odd, and I can't remember the historic reasons why we ended up with such a small field that year.
No.
But it looked like when they set off,
Yeah.
that it was the second circuit they were going out on. You know,
Yeah,
it was
okay.
such a reduced field. Then once you get into it, you forget about that. And it was still a race full of drama.
It was, yeah.
I think the point about getting a better quality of horse into the race, that can bring a danger because those horses can go faster again. Maybe that increases risk. And I think the huge pot of money at the end of the race also increases risk because you get more competitive riding. Now, last year's race was, I think, a little bit of an outlier. It was a bit like 2013. In that I think it had been made so clear to all the jockeys involved, we've got to get through this race with nothing terrible happening.
Yeah.
And they rode with great responsibility. I think in last year's race they really spread themselves out, used the width of the course, even though it was a reduced number of runners.
And is that, well, yeah,
but
which
let me finish this point. The winners ended up going right around the inside and had an uncontested run up there.
Yeah.
Now, hopefully they'll stick to that similar ethos this time, but I think it's only natural with £500,000 on the line, you're going to see these jockeys sort of gravitating a little bit more to the inside. And even with 34 runners, if they all go that way, you're going to run out of room.
And of course, whenever you do something for a good reason, there are often negative, unintended consequences that come of it. And you can argue that the changes made to Beechers Brook, where once upon a time, that the drop on the inside was so much greater than on the outside that horses fanned across the track.
They really did, yeah.
If they're not afraid of Beechers Brook anymore, and realistically, it jumps like pretty much every other fence on the track now. If you're not afraid of Beechers Brook, there's probably less of an incentive to fan out across the track.
Do you remember, it was at 88 when Peter
Strands of
Scudamore
Gold.
went right up the end of Strands of Gold, and he got criticised for it afterwards. But he was basically the only guy there, and everything else was sort of middle to outer at Beechers Brook, because for the reason you said, it's just more jumpable.
Yeah.
In reality, Strands of Gold would have fallen just about any fence had he got as high as that, or as low as that.
Yeah.
So I don't blame him at all. But the fact was that people said you should be riding wider. Nobody says that now about that course these days. And the other thing is, again, if they can all jump all of these fences, then they all get around to the canal turn.
Yeah.
And then again, it's a pinch point, isn't it? You're starting to run out of room if you go. The year when they took the stuffing out the fences, the 40 horses cleared the first 7 fences, and then the first unseated you got a canal turn because people had nowhere to go on landing. So I'm always wary of tinkering with something like that when it was a known quantity before, and then you end up with an unexpectedly different version of what went on.
So that being the case, we have seen what people like Sarah Bradstock, Sue Smith, Rich Newland, Kim Bailey have said in the last few days. They've all made suggestions to what they think should be done, and obviously in the case of Sarah Bradstock, there's a personal element too, because she has Mr. Vango. He's had a tremendous season with the Midlands National the other day, who looks unlikely to get into the race as things stand. They've all offered ideas. Do any of them, Jonathan, particularly appeal to you in terms of what you think should be done in relation to the 2026 Grand National and beyond?
So one of the consequences of the changes is that it is now attracting a higher calibre of horse, which I'm not against in and of itself, having the best horses running in the race. That has to be the case. But I do like the idea of, if there's a middle ground between that and having some win and you're in races, so that you you're still getting those really good horses in there at the top of the weights, but you're also ensuring that it's not exclusively former Gold Cup hopes or current Gold Cup hopes at the top of the weights, that you have those slots for the horses that are running in the regional nationals. I think it creates a more joined up kind of campaign towards Aintree as well, which makes our job a lot easier when you're trying to piece together these bits of the jump season. If it's a win and you're in for the national, we might then improve the quality of those races as well. I think the direction of travel is a better quality of horse running in this race because it's different to how it was. I'm not against that as a principle, and I enjoyed it as a spectacle last year. It was cleaner and easier to watch. At the same time though, you do need to ensure that the door is not completely closed on some of those horses who would have got in previous years and aren't perhaps as classy, but are the type of horses who definitely get the trip and can provide those stories that we enjoy. Because I think the last thing we want is, you know, the same trainers, the same owners winning the national every single year.
But just on the winning you're in, I'm basically in favour of the idea. I don't like being in a world where you can win the Scottish Grand National and have no hope of making the cut for the next year's Grand National. But I just worry that the sort of horse that you're introducing to the race is the kind of horse that would have been suited to a Grand National of 20 years ago. I mean, a lot of those races that you would instinctively pick, you know, Scottish National, Midlands National, the Eider Chase, the Welsh National, you know, they're still won by basically slow horses, you know, wonderful, admirable, likeable, charismatic, plodding horses can just go in the same gear forever. And if last year's Grand National is like the kind of national that we're going to keep on getting, you know, some of those are going to get lapped. I think Mr. Vango would be at risk of that if it didn't come up mud, which it probably won't.
Not this year anyway.
I mean, my sympathy for them is, I love Sarah Bradstock, and everyone connected with Mr. Vango, but he's won 3 big Saturday races this season. You know, he's had a great time. They've all had a great time. They made a bit of money, hopefully. And he's on a high enough rating that he'll definitely get into the race next year unless they, you know, get him beat 6 times. But even then, I think he's going to be on such a run, the handicapper is going to be slow to drop him, right? So
Are you saying stop mithering?
I can't feel sorry for them, you know. They've had a great time, and if they were desperate to get into the Grand National, they had to get that sort of Midlands National level of performance out of him before the first week in February, and then he'd been in.
So on that one, then in terms of what you might do, I also like the win and you're in, albeit I accept the points that you make there, Chris, about could it bring in the wrong sort of horse in the race. But I've written loads of times. I like winning your ins. You will both know my affection for the Melbourne Cup, where they have, again, races that you can win and get into race. It helps to build interest through the run-up to the race because each of those when you're in races becomes a big destination contest in itself. I would also like, and I've kind of written this, I'd like to see the Grand National treated in the same way that other handicaps are, I think, apart from the Bet365 Gold Cup, whereby once the weights are published, you can still get a penalty for winning thereafter. Now, I know you can look at that both ways, and you can say, will that not mean that the best horses are kept away, protected, don't run much before the race? But you can argue that's happening anyway. You look at Iron Maximus, Intense Raffles, they've not had a huge amount of racing this season. They've certainly not been, that busy in terms of running races this season, the number of races they've run in. So I think it's already happening. But I think if you had a situation whereby, say, for example, after the weights come out, you've got the Grand National trial at Haydock maybe, you've got the Ultima at Cheltenham, you've got the Midlands National. Each of those races, if you had a horse who was number 50 in the order of entry, who might then get a penalty that gets him or her into the National, I think that adds interest into it too. But I can see from your face you do not like the idea.
Well, so again, it's change, and change is terrible. I don't know if I've ever really thought of the Grand National as a recent form kind of race. It's a race that you're aiming at for 18 months or maybe even longer. The type of horse that wins it, I think it's not unusual for them to not have won a race that season. You know, you're not necessarily looking for horses that have won in the last month, and there, you know, there's some danger, I think, if you're trying to encourage people to show their best form on a racecourse in the month before the National. They use themselves up and they get to Aintree and they don't have much left. Whereas, you know, the kind of horses that maybe have an O or a P in their recent form get to Aintree fresh as paint and ready to go.
Okay.
So that's my instinct. But then maybe that's why I backed so many losers in the race over the years.
What about, was it Richard Newland? Certainly made the point about limiting, I think Sarah Barker said maybe as well, limiting the number of runners any one trainer can have. Now, you've written plenty and said plenty in the past about your wish to see some of the superpowers more curtailed in what they can do in terms of. So would you be going along with that? Would you like to see a situation where Willie Mullins or Paul Nicholls or Gordon Elliott or an owner could only have a certain number of runners in the Grand National?
Owner is a slightly different conversation, but I certainly think there's a risk of really big time trainers just being able to flood the race with runners. And now that you're down to 34, you could quite realistically have the top 2 trainers, the 2 most prolific trainers, having more than half the field. You can't be sure how much the wider public notices that. But anybody who's really keen on racing, I think that does take some of the colour away from it. Yeah, I would be in favour of a limit. But I think it shouldn't really be done on a race-by-race basis. The sport should be taking a view about what's the optimum, maximum size for any racing stable.
Okay.
And that's how you ensure plurality. That's how you get lots of big-time stables instead of just a small number. And that makes the whole game more interesting, I think.
John?
Similar view, I think. In an ideal world, you would almost have 34 different trainers in the race, wouldn't you, each with a viable chance. But I think it's one of those ideas that in practice would encounter all sorts of problems. I do appreciate we're in radical change territory and it is required, but you can just imagine how that would go down we've already seen how you sort of float these ideas and they do not go down particularly well with those involved. That's not a reason not to do it, of course. It's a tough one, isn't it? I just can't see it happening, so it's almost not.
It's hard to imagine. Racing's got no form, has it, for reducing the power of the most powerful people in the game. We've never done that kind of thing, have we?
Just one thought just pops into my head. We've spoken about how the races change and the fences are easier to jump than they used to be. And yet, we heard last week that the Cheltenham Gold Cup winner, I know the way you're thinking, who was set to be a stone plus well in the race this year, won't run. And one of the reasons given by Gavin Cromwell was a reason he given in the winter during why he didn't really have that much enthusiasm for running this year, was that he thought it would be potentially damaging to the horse's jumping progress, that the horse had been jumping better, and he thought running in the Grand National could set that progress back. So he clearly thinks that there's something different about the Grand National and jumping in the Grand National.
So the fences still look different.
Yeah.
And I suppose you and I can probably think of lots of examples of horses over the years who, having had a normal career up to the point where they run in the National, after that, they're just Grand National horses. When they run elsewhere, they seem to run a bit flat. They go back to Aintree and they're switched on again.
I love it.
So there's a risk that you end up doing that to him. If they get so stimulated by that atmosphere and the sight of those fences that other tracks just don't do it for them anymore. But I think fundamentally they just don't need to. They've got a really good horse. They're going to stick to top quality races with relatively small fields. You don't have to put them in the unknown situation of taking on 33 others in a handicap. Plus, part of me thinks that they might have other contenders as well. They do have other contenders. Both of them together are in Percival the Galwa, who's a pretty interesting runner this time.
He is, yeah. I'm going to get on to who you fancy in a second. Might even leave that to the end of the show to add excitement. Just one little vignette. So last week I went to a function dinner with a number of sports editors. It was hosted by Randox with Aintree. And although it's one of those things, I think I'm telling tales to say that there was an awful lot of enthusiasm from those sports editors for the Grand National. They all, and for Cheltenham, they all made clear that it was a big positive for them in terms of circulation, that Cheltenham comes along, Grand National comes along, numbers go up. There was real positivity around the race. And that's to be welcome too, isn't it? When we get to Grand National Day, I'll reference Grand National Grandstand as a kid watching Des Lynam, and we're still going to have on Grand National Day, I'm imagining 4 hours plus of live coverage on ITV. It'll be all over the radio. Every newspaper will have the Grand National over their front pages. So it still resonates much more than any other horse race that we have in our part of the
significantly
world.
more. Most
Yeah.
people wouldn't. I mean, most people in the street might not even be that familiar with Cheltenham, but everybody knows the Grand National. The flip side of that is, not to put a downer on it, obviously it's incredibly positive and it cuts through and you have these great stories appearing places they wouldn't normally.
Yeah.
If it goes badly wrong, then those same sports editors are very interested in that as well. And there is an element of,
Totally.
I think that is why I understand some of the reactions to when the changes are first brought in, because it is a concession of ground, I suppose, is how it's viewed in some corners, not by me.
Yeah.
But I do think that the risk v reward of that specific race, the spotlight is on racing in a way it just simply isn't at any other time of the year, and that's why it has to be right.
It's a source of controversy, isn't it? That's why any media outlet is going to love it, because it's just, you know, it's that week is just taken care of. You know, there's your hot talking point,
Yeah.
whatever happens. But nearly for like an aging racing fan like me, nearly the most fun part of Grand National Week is, you know, reliving all those old stories, looking at all the old videos. It's great fun. And, you know, even though you're sort of thinking in the back of your head, well, this is clearly not the same race as it used to be.
Yeah.
But still, you know, you might as well wallow in nostalgia while you can. I just worry that the way it is just now, we're not going to generate stories in the way that the old race used to. And if that keeps happening for a period of years, the outside world is going to notice that you're not getting those happy tales in quite the same quantity as we used to.
We definitely got loads of happy tales, big stories at the Cheltenham Festival, and when we return, we should be talking about changes already announced to the 2026 meeting. Welcome back to the front page. We've been chatting about Aintree. Now we move on to Cheltenham. We had our review of the festival in last week's show, but now something completely different in terms of what it costs to get to the festival, whether one day is a style day or a ladies' day. And Chris Cook had some views to express in his column last week. John, Chris is going to have a. I suspect Chris will get carried away when he's talking about.
Oh no!
In a good way, but you're
Never
hot under
happened
your
before.
collar. But we had an announcement last week from Cheltenham that in relation to the 2026 festival, for which tickets are already on sale, you'll be able to find those on the Jockey Club's website. Some prices have been reduced, so just looking here, if you want an early bird ticket price for Gold Cup Day in the best mate enclosure, you'll pay £3 less to 50 quid.
Getting
for
excited
53.
for a second there.
If you want to go in the club enclosure on the same day, actually in the Tassels enclosure, you can pay 67 quid, which is down £3 from last year. Admission for each of the first 3 days is priced at £35 the best mate, 52 quid in Tats, £83 in the club enclosure, although prices dropped to £31.50, £46.80 and £74.70 respectively per day when bought through multi-day packages. And the other big announcement, I'm not sure you can call it a big announcement, but another announcement was that Ladies' Day, which used to be the Wednesday of the festival, which I think since 2018 has been known as Style Wednesday, is no longer Style Wednesday. It will once again be Ladies' Day, which presumably means that Style Wednesday as a concept has been humiliated and binned after only 6 years.
I didn't know it was a concept before.
Well, it was.
Okay. It's one of those I didn't. There's nothing materially about the experience of being there that tells you it was Style Wednesday.
So you didn't wear anything different on the Wednesday compared to Thursday or Friday?
No.
No? Well, you look very smart on all 3 days.
Well, thank you very much.
As did you.
There's ticket prices
now I
are
know
good
you're lying.
news, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's recognition, isn't it, that obviously numbers have fallen again, as we discussed last week, from last year to this year, having fallen from the previous year to last year. They need to do something about it, and they already took action this year by trying to improve the customer experience. And I think by general acknowledgement, people seem to have had a better time this year than they had last year, but they would want more people having a good time than had a good time this year, and therefore reducing some ticket prices and trying
It's
to
going to take a bit of
rebrand
time.
one of the days.
It's going to take a bit of time, isn't it? It's changed the mood music. I think reputations are hard earned and easily lost, and there is a perception around the Cheltenham Festival now that it is not value for money. And even if we reach a point where objectively it is value for money, there is a lag behind people in the general public realising that and accepting that, okay, the mood music's changed, my perception of it shifted, and this is a value for money event. It's going to take more than £3 reductions to the ticket price to do that. And I think something that has encouraged me is Cheltenham are aware of the sort of emotive issues. It doesn't feel like a lot talking about the bus from the station or the car parking or the price of a pint of Guinness, but those are the things that generate headlines, and I think those are the areas, and indeed ticket prices and accommodation, that require the most focus now.
And now, Chris, moving on to your column, so John talks about value for money. If you put to one side the accommodation prices in Cheltenham, which we know during festival, I think I've used the word obscene at times, which might be a bit harsh on some establishments, but some of the prices just seem
no, it is obscene, that's the right word.
Blow your mind crazy stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. You put that to one side because that's not within Cheltenham's or the Jockey Club's direct control.
Yeah.
In terms of value for money, your column on Friday was indicating that your position is that maybe the Cheltenham Festival isn't providing value for money.
I don't think I said that in as many words. I mean, my position is that the ticket price, I'm comfortable with being on a par with other major sporting events. I mean, it's a huge, fantastic event.
Yeah.
Anyone who goes there who has the least bit of interest in racing or betting ought to have a really great time.
Yeah.
I do sort of feel that the prices once you're in the door are ambitious.
Prices for things like
food and drink.
Yeah.
And that's where I think there's scope to show people a little bit more friendliness than is happening at the moment. Because once they've paid for that, large sum of money to get in the door, you should be treating them like a mate, I think, and a supporter of the sport. And I don't necessarily feel that everybody feels they're being treated that way. And you can, I just felt in the week after Cheltenham, you saw that spilling over into the wider media. So there were all the stories about people going to Benidorm to watch from there, and talking about how it was actually cheaper to go over there and stay in some hotel than it would be to get from, say, London to Cheltenham and stay a night in one of those expensive hotels we just mentioned. But then there was another story that got a bit of traction in one of the tabloids. This girl who's sort of prepping to go to the Cheltenham races was filmed by her pal, sort of strapping pouches of vodka to her legs and then sort of hiding it under big baggy trousers, because when they get into Cheltenham, they don't want to be paying the sort of inflated prices for drinks, and presumably, joining the end of a really long queue as well to get the drinks in the first place. It looked kind of cumbersome. It didn't look a particularly attractive way of tackling the problem to me. All that sellotape on your skin, for one thing, that's only going to end badly. And if you're into drinking pints, the quantity doesn't really work.
Guinness would go right to your kneecap, wouldn't it, really?
Oh, and you'd be sloshing, and that's a lot to explain, right? Good, but I thought that was interesting that seemed to get a lot of readers, and I think that the event's reputation in the wider public is now that of quite an expensive event to go to, which it never used to be. I mean, the festival in the public eye, in my mind, it was always the sort of one of those sort of really cool parties that people were discovering in increasing numbers, and unexpectedly having a really good time. As we started to get some nice weather again, and people who wouldn't normally go racing would go. Henry Cavill was there last week, and that kind of stuff that would make it out into the wider public domain. But now the money thing is taking over, and I think that's a sign that perhaps prices are higher than they need to be. You have to look after your reputation, you have to look after your goodwill, and I think that points in the direction of being a bit less ambitious with the old pricing.
John, you're a football fan, you go to other sporting events, you're a big Arsenal boy. Would you find that going to a Premier League football match, you would be paying the same sort of prices for your pint or your sandwich or your pie as you would do at Cheltenham?
Yeah, it's not a million miles off, is it? We've done that research, and the pint at the football or at the cricket or rugby is you are paying a premium because you are at that event, just like you pay a premium for coffee when you're in a coffee shop because you're not at home making it. It's
or
not
on service station.
Yeah, it's not a direct comparison. There's certain contextual elements that come into play. I don't think it's a million miles off the cost of booze. I also do think that if you're a student, having been one not all that long ago, they could be £3 a pint and you'd still try and sneak some in potentially. I don't think it's necessarily the fact that it's that expensive. I do think there's an element of, well, you just try it anyway, which I would never condone, of course.
No.
Well said.
Well, did you reference it? I'm sure you referenced in your column that the binoculars.
Oh yes, that's right. There was a girl caught at the side of the paddock by ITV Racing a few years ago, taking sips of something from her flask that was disguised as a pair of binoculars. That looked pretty cool. And then I went online and did a bit of research, and apparently it's really easy to come by these flasks that are disguised as binoculars.
I don't know why I would never.
It's turned into quite a market, apparently.
Never really occurred to me that sort of hip flask then wouldn't be allowed. You couldn't bring a hip flask. Or could you bring a hip
I'm
flask?
sure, like when I started going racing, I'm sure I used to see people with hip flasks undisguisedly. But yeah, so that was maybe when it was closer to pointing and hunter chasing and that kind of atmosphere. They're not allowed now. You obviously can't bring in your own booze unless you come up with a cunning disguise, as some people seemingly have. And I looked at the reviews for some of these flask/binoculars, and one of them was talking explicitly about how it was great for Cheltenham.
And can you still watch a Triumpherdal with them? Or is it basically...
Well, that would be the only way of identifying the winner beforehand, I think,
through what you did there.
Yeah. Well, so my line in the paper was, if you see anyone who's got bins strapped around their neck but never uses them, sidle over and ask for a swig is the price of your silence.
Yeah, I can see that working.
It's going to be there's going to be more of those sold, I think, if booze prices remain as they are.
I could see as well, although they've announced the ticket prices for next year, you could still see some packages being introduced whereby, you get a package and it includes your first pint free, or it includes a pie free, or a sandwich, just something to try and...
Pie free? I don't think that's the Cheltenham audience that they're in.
No, okay.
I want to say I don't want to be too negative about the festival, because although the total attendance was down like 10,000 on last year, it was still a big crowd felt like a big crowd on most days.
Thursday and Friday, certainly,
Wednesday was kind of quiet.
That was the lowest day since the turn of the century, wasn't it, Festival Day?
Yeah. But even so, when I was wandering around, I don't remember at any point thinking, we really need more people in here. It was always busy. There was always a really good atmosphere. Yeah. And especially on the first day, I think that's when it really matters. When they're about to start the Supreme Novice Hurdle. And all you want to see if you're looking out from the stands is that sea of heads, no concrete anywhere, and there was none, and a really big roar.
And there was a big roar, wasn't there? Yeah.
So it was a big crowd, completely engaged, which is no small achievement in times like these when people are feeling kind of broke.
Completely right. Yeah, totally.
So, I don't want to be down on the event at all.
No. I thought, speaking to racegoers during the week, I thought there was a lot of positivity about their experience this year compared to last year. One thing I can't remember if I said in the programme last week, I referenced in my column last week, it seems to me that the key thing for the Jockey Club to do now is to find a way whereby the percentage of its profit every year that comes from the Cheltenham Festival isn't quite so high. The Jockey Club is very heavily dependent on the festival in terms of its annual income, if you like. It needs to try and find a way of making more money out of its other festivals, out of conferences, out of events, out of land, out of property, which doesn't mean selling racecourses, but it just mean think about how you use the land around racecourses that isn't actually the track itself.
That's the point. You just don't want the people who come to that event to feel milked,
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
So
so we've done Aintree, we have done Cheltenham. When we come back, we'll be looking at racing economy, and also my esteemed colleagues will be telling you who will win this year's Randox Grand National. Welcome back to the front page. We will be telling you who's going to win the Grand National at some point in the very near future. But before we do that, our Racing and the Economy series ran last week. It was very close to my heart, having worked on it for a little while. It looked across 3 days at the extent to which local and national, the local economies and the national economy benefit from horse racing. Day one focused on the extent to which one horse, in this case a jukebox man, can benefit the local economy around him, not through prize money or through training fees, but just by the extent to which service providers, if you like, who come into the yard or away from the yard, do work with the horse in the yard will benefit from him. We estimate around £10,000 for him or any horse in Ben Pauling's yard would be that benefit to the economy, and extrapolating from that you can make a figure of £140 million across the whole economy from racehorses trained in Britain. Day 2 looked at the impact of racecourses on the economy of big tracks, small tracks. A little track like Carmel will have an added benefit to the economy of around 1.7 million quid over the year. Obviously big festivals, huge sums of money. And then in part 3 we looked at the politics of it and how racing can best leverage its value to the economy when talking to government right now about important matters, crucial matters even, such as affordability checks and levy reform. No need to repeat what was in the pieces, but just maybe fast forwarding, John, to part 3 and the comment I did on Monday about how racing can leverage that. Racing has a lot of things it wants to get from government right now, let's say on affordability checks, on levy reform. One point that was put to me was that maybe racing needs to be a little bit careful about hammering home the rural aspect, given we've got a Labour government now, which does have a lot of more rural MPs than it used to, but it's primarily an urban-based party. But that actually isn't a hard thing to do, because rural and urban racing has massive links to the British economy.
Yeah, I think that's the golden question, isn't it, really, is how racing can use all the things that you spelled out rather neatly in the first 2 parts about the impact on the economy, how it can use that to push forward in areas such as affordability, and in particular levy reform, which is viewed as sort of a mitigation to the impact that the affordability checks are having. I'd agree that that has to be targeted. I think the worry is that when you're within the sport, these are all massive issues and they feel huge, which they are, and they're in some cases kind of existential. But for the government, which is presumably getting that from various different industries saying what you're doing is impacting us and everything else, I think a targeted, sensible approach is probably the way to do it. I think if you start banging the drum too often about too many things, you perhaps lose a bit of goodwill from the government on the areas that you actually need to focus on, which is levy reform and these affordability checks.
And Chris, that was a point that Conor McGinn made in the piece. That he referenced that tractor protest at Fakenham, and said, look, no doubt that loads of people in racing are impacted by things like the inheritance tax changes, national insurance changes, but if you want to have a go at government, you need to be quite selective and do something that's really going to get bang for your buck. And that made me just think about other matters whereby racing's leadership has to decide, do we go all in on this or not? Things like the Welsh greyhound ban, when the BHA put out a statement about that, was nothing really that was supportive of greyhound racing as a sport, nothing clear that said it's great that racing in Wales is doing well, but we're gutted that greyhound racing is coming to an end and it shouldn't be. And there's that whole debate around the extent to which racing should be seeking to separate betting on racing from gaming in terms of bookmaker products, and saying, well, look, this is good, that is bad. They're difficult questions for racing's leadership.
And if they're difficult for them, then so much harder for the government that we would have ministers that are being newly introduced to these topics. So that's why clarity is such a big thing, clarity of message, and it takes ages, like years really, to sort of warm up a government minister to the idea that change is needed in your particular area. And it bothers me slightly that we're going through a period in racing just now where our leaders are in flux. We got an acting chief executive of the BHA, don't we still?
We do.
Chairman hasn't started yet. Yes, exactly the same at the top of the jockey club. I wouldn't. It would be going too far, I think, to say the sport is rudderless, but we need to get people established in those positions who become familiar to the government ministers, in time for them to make some change that will hopefully help the sport. And as Conor McGinn was saying in your piece, in the meantime, there's the question of diplomacy. I realise that most people in racing are not actually sympathetic to a Labour government, but there's that danger that if the sport as a whole seems to be just opposed to the idea of Labour, then you're not going to get any kind of dialogue going. They can just put a line through you and say, well, we're never going to get votes or support from this area. They're not going to speak our language, and therefore, we'll spend our attention elsewhere. If you want the government to positively do something, make a change in your area that perhaps involves them sacrificing some money that would otherwise go to the exchequer, then you have to make them feel that they can work with you, that you can work together, and it's not going to be a continual slanging match, and that you'll actually be grateful if they do something for you.
Just have to make it easy, don't you? These are the figures, this is the case, this is what we would like you to do about it. Put your rubber stamp on it. I think when you start muddying the waters and start dipping in and out of various other issues or getting involved in fights that aren't specific to British racing, it might complicate things. I think it's as simple as, this is what we contribute to the economy, this is what's happening at the moment that's causing us to struggle a little bit. Here's a solution, because all the solutions are there, they're pretty much ready to go. All we need is you to pay attention to us for just 5 minutes and sort it.
And I wouldn't be backing off the rural thing either, because I think probably with the Labour government, they'd be really worried about that idea that if racing contracts to a significant degree, that's going to create real problems in lots of rural areas where a Labour government wouldn't naturally know how to sort of stimulate that economy again. How are you going to replace those jobs? How are you going to create new jobs in those rural areas? It's notoriously difficult, and I think that's positively going to scare Labour ministers.
And interesting, Tim Bonnet of the Countryside Alliance made the point that because that rural community, the rural Britain has all set to be hit by things like the Inheritance Tax change for farmers, national insurance, etc., that actually now is a good time to try and make ground on those racing issues, because they won't want to antagonise the rural part of the country anymore. Just finally, we in terms of racing politics, we had on during the week the National Trainers Federation AGM. Headlines made when William Haggis asked his colleagues to raise their hands in terms of who they thought ran British racing. BHA or the racecourses. Racecourses' hands went up. BHA didn't go up. Not really new news that trainers think racecourses have too much power, but a lot of senior racing leaders were in the room, and they sort of said, we hear you. Was it all fair comment? What was said in that AGM?
You can completely understand why it was said. This is something that goes back a very long way, though, isn't it? There was a new mechanism for making decisions agreed. What was it, 18 months ago?
New governance structure.
So I think we're stuck with it for the time being. But it's it's interesting that it seems to have lost the support of the horsemen quite so quickly.
Although, John, there is clearly that momentum view that racecourses are too powerful. If you look purely at how the structures are made up, BHA board, same number of participant representatives as racecourse representatives, commercial committee, ditto. Surely part of the problem is that the participants haven't been as good at presenting a united view as racecourses have, and you can see in recent months with Peter Savile's PRA situation, that just further muddies the waters. So who's actually representing us? Is it PRA? Is it the thoroughbred group? And perhaps if the participants were better at that side of things, which might be, for example, having some more commercial people on the commercial committee, that they might be better at influencing their own power.
I think that's a fair comment. I think there's probably a sense that they've occasionally been outboxed by the race courses, but ultimately this all comes down to a long-standing mistrust, and for me the only way that you combat that mistrust is transparency, which is around those commercial agreements, which is happening between the thoroughbred groups and the race courses. They need to be accelerated, need to be continued in good faith, and I think hopefully at the end of there might be a little bit more understanding between the two parties, because at the moment they are at either extreme, aren't they? If you're a trainer, you're looking at the return that you receive, you're looking at the costs, you're looking at everything that's going the wrong way. Naturally, you're going to look at these guys over there who won't show you their accounts, who are a little bit unclear about how much they make and all the revenue and where it's going. The money comes in, the trainers don't necessarily feel as though it trickles all the way down. There's going to be mistrust. The best way of fixing that is transparency.
And ultimately, we need a situation where the BHA really is in control, and a situation where that what the late Joe Sommer-Smith so regularly said, where people have to leave their vested interests outside the ring when making these big decisions. They have to think long term, not short term, about what's good for the whole of racing in the long term, not what's good for me, my shareholders, my company, or my bonus right now.
But in order to take that kind of attitude, which we would all like, you have to trust the other guy, right? You know, and it just doesn't feel like people in racing are ready to do that yet. There's so much friction and tension constantly, which is why these negotiations struggle to make any progress.
But in good news, as we end the show, you may or may not now hear who wins this year's Randox Grand National.
I know which is more likely.
I'll get mine out of the way first, because I've already had a few anti-posts. I backed some of the obvious ones towards the head of the market.
I wondered who was moving the market.
Yeah, thank you.
How many bets have you had?
I've backed iMaximus, Iroko and Intense Raffles anti-post. Iroko some way out a few months ago. The other two more recently. And a long way out as well, I backed Beauport. After his long walk hurdle.
Are you calling out for some sort of intervention here? Do you know what this is? We were walking at Cheltenham together, and you said that you just had your best festival ever.
Yes.
So you just got a bit carried away with yourself, haven't you? Is that what's going on?
I had a good festival. I had a good festival, which means the flat season will probably be absolutely appalling.
I hope so.
Starting with a Lincoln on Saturday. What about you then? Grand National?
Well, I've actually tipped two out loud in the column that I do, so I'd better not add to that until next week. I probably will tip a third horse next week, but we're going to wait till then. So Grange Clear West, and Percival Agawa. Interestingly, Grange Clear has actually shortened in the last few days, and nobody's really talked about why that might be. He was 40s in places, and now you can't get better than 25s with the standard bookies. On the exchange, his price doesn't seem to have moved much at all. So I just wonder if there's a little bit of a phantom move, if it's bookies saying, once you see a horse that's actually going for the race, let's shorten his price a bit.
In fact, he didn't go to Cheltenham. Presumably underlines that this was what they're looking
Yeah,
at.
I think so. I mean, he would have been a Gold Cup horse, and, Willie had another one for that.
Yeah.
A lot of people were disappointed with the last run, but I think it was just to make sure that he was qualified, really. I think the circumstances of that race didn't suit him particularly. You couldn't expect him to show up much better than he did. He's a proper stayer. He was in a 2.5 mile race, taking on 2 mile horses, 3 weeks after the best run of his career. Yeah. So, you couldn't say that he's lightly weighted. When I put him up, it was before the weights were published. And I think the handicappers had a right go at him. So I wish he was like 3 or 4 pounds.
Had a right go at him.
Lower down, but where I was expecting him to be. But I still think he's potentially the right type for the new national.
Okay, and between now and next Saturday, the front runner is going to be all over the Grand National. I can envisage you having a right good time between now and next Saturday.
But I'm just going to try and come up with some different angles and not too many more losing tips.
Well, there will be loads of different angles, I am certain. And Jonathan Harding, your Grand National winner or winners?
I'm going to stick with the same horse because I'm going to try not to bounce around too much. I've been Can Do Kid for a long time.
Okay.
I feel like he's just perfect for that race.
Okay, Can Do Kid for Jonathan. I reckon that is it. Thank you for staying with us during the course of this journey. Thanks to Jonathan, thanks to Chris. We will be back next week when there will almost certainly be more Grand National chat. Until then, goodbye.